This is the second lecture for Wednesday, April 22nd. And we're looking at the flow of nutrients through ecosystems, and we're at these last two important nutrients, recognizing the importance of phosphorus and the different macromolecules that it's found in, very important. And then sulfur is the last thing for us to look at. So I showed you in the previous lecture the cycling of sulfur to illustrate, as with some other compounds, other molecules, other elements, that there's these different forms, different places within the ecosystem where we find sulfur, in the water, in organisms, in sediments, and there's different forms as well of sulfur, just like we saw different forms of carbon, different forms of phosphate or phosphorus, different forms of nitrogen, a lot of different forms of nitrogen. Well, the same is true for sulfate. You find sulfate, you find sulfur, the element, and that combined with oxygen to form sulfate, and a number of different forms of sulfur in parts of the ecosystem that have interactions with living things. Sulfur is important for a number of different structures, a number of different macromolecules in living things, certainly not on the level of importance of nitrogen and phosphorus, but also very important. So, what kind of forms of sulfur do you find? Sulfate, as I mentioned before, is a very common one. Sulfate, SO4, is found in a couple of different places, in rocks, in minerals, in sediments, and then there's sulfur in the atmosphere. There's hydrogen sulfide, H2S, that's produced by volcanoes. It's the rotten egg smell that you detect around swamps, bogs, those kind of things when anaerobic respiration is taking place. Hydrogen sulfide is formed. There's also sulfur dioxide that's produced from volcanoes. There's sulfate, again, that's in sediments and rocks. It also enters into the atmosphere to a certain degree from sea spray. And then there's even other forms, dimethyl sulfide from marine algae. And the sulfur is incorporated into different amino acids. There's a few amino acids that have sulfur. So the transitions that are taking place, sulfur being transformed from one form to another, that sulfate is assimilated out of the sediments, for the most part, into different forms of organic sulfur. So in other words, it's incorporated into amino acids, for instance, or part of the organism that contains sulfur in their cells, in different macromolecules. And then organisms die. There's some excess sulfate that's excreted from organisms, along with other ions, other elements that are in excess. And then it enters back into the soil. So let's look quickly at this sulfur cycle, and not to go into that much detail, but there's organic sulfur. If you look all the way over there in the upper left, this is sulfur that's part of an organism. It's part of an amino acid, for instance. There's a couple of amino acids that contain sulfur. And then if you look at what's happening here with the organisms that are involved, some of it is bacteria. This photoautotrophic bacteria can use sulfur, and these sulfur compounds anyway, as a source of making ATP. It's not that widespread, but they're producing H2S, iron sulfide, and then so basically you have the cycling of sulfur between living things in organic sulfur and these other forms of sulfur, sulfide, sulfate, sulfite, and it cycles around between living things and non-living things. And then if you look at this again in this representative form that I showed you before, There's no quantities that are shown in this figure, but you get an idea of the occurrence of sulfur in different places, in living things, in sediments, a little in the atmosphere, and some in the water. But for the most part, there's a lot of sulfur in living things. There's a lot of sulfur in the sediments. There's some sulfur in the air. There's some sulfur in the water. And so around and around it goes, this sulfur, certainly on a smaller scale than we saw with carbon, nitrogen, and to a certain degree with phosphorus as well. Okay, so we've gone through these different things, and look, here's that same slide we've been seeing, but there's another sentence on here, and that's the role of microorganisms in nutrient cycling. Now, you can take a microbiology class and study bacteria for the most part. Bacteria are very important. They're often overlooked. People that study bacteria lament all the time about how bacteria don't receive the amount of attention that they deserve because they're so important in so many different things. Nutrient cycling, bacteria is certainly important. So in terms of microorganisms in nutrient cycling, we saw how important bacteria was, especially with nitrogen, but with other elements as well, other nutrients. So let's just take a few minutes to emphasize, again, the importance of microorganisms. And by that, we're primarily talking about bacteria. So, one aspect of the role of microorganisms in nutrient cycling are these chemoautotrophs. There's bacteria that can use energy that's stored in chemical bonds in inorganic substances. And what that means is that these bacteria can make ATP not from light, like photosynthetic organisms, and not from eating things, like heterotrophs, not from eating plants or eating other animals. They don't have to eat organic matter to make ATP. They don't have to have light to make ATP. What they can do is that they can take energy that's liberated when bonds are broken. They have enzymes that can break bonds between these chemicals, and when those bonds are broken, the energy is given off. That's like energy that comes from the sun. That's like energy that's given off when bonds are broken between carbons in a donut or some source of food. That energy can be used to make ATP. That ATP can then be used to join carbons together to make sugar. So you have to make ATP, first of all. Animals like us, we do that by burning fuel in our cells. Plants and photosynthetic organisms do that by converting light energy to electrons and then ATP. So some of the things that are used, these inorganic substrates, they're not part of living things. It's not like food that's organic that can be used. So methane is not inorganic. Methane is organic. But you and I couldn't eat methane and use it as a source of fuel. We don't have the enzymes to be able to do that. But you can, if you're a chemoautotroph, you can break down methane. You can break bonds between hydrogen. You can break the bonds within ammonia, nitrite as well. You can break those bonds down. That's what nitrifying bacteria do. They use those as a source of energy. And then another really common one in anaerobic situations and hydrothermal vents is that you can break the bonds between hydrogen and sulfide. You can break the bonds in sulfate. You can break bonds that involve sulfur. And there's also these iron-containing salts. These chemoautotrophs have the capability of breaking those bonds, using the energy that's given off. Breaking bonds liberates energy in a lot of chemical reactions. and then using that energy to make ATP. So it's not a widespread metabolic process, and you don't find these type of bacteria all over the place. And in terms of the amount of energy that enters into trophic webs as a result of chemoautotrophic organisms, it's very, very small. It's just a fraction of the energy that enters into trophic webs. And almost all of the energy, 99 point something percent, comes from sunlight rather than chemoautotrophs. But it's an important role of microorganisms, and it illustrates this completely different metabolic pathway and source of generating ATP besides light, like photosynthetic organisms, and besides food, that organisms that eat things use as a source of energy for making ATP. Well, there's a number of decomposers out there. Fungi, like mushrooms and fungi, are important decomposers. They secrete enzymes outside of the body, and they digest things, and then they incorporate that food basically into their cells, make ATP. Similar to animals, except they digest things outside of their cells, as opposed to having a digestive system like a lot of animals. But the other major decomposers, not fungi, not these macroscopic things, but they're microscopic, and they're bacteria, they're microorganisms. And another way that these microorganisms are very important in nutrient cycling is as decomposers. You've got all these plants, you've got all these animals that die, and they fall onto the ground. They're part of the leaf litter. They fall into the sediments in the ocean. So one of the things that decomposers can do in the form of these microorganisms, bacteria decomposers anyway, is that they can cycle some of these things back into the atmosphere. They can break down things that, like nitrogen-containing compounds, and the end result is gaseous nitrogen. And we saw this when we looked at the nitrogen cycle, that these bacteria are taking an energy source like glucose, and they're taking nitrate, and the end products of that metabolic reaction, that metabolic pathway, are carbon dioxide and water, the typical end products of cellular respiration. But they're getting energy from it, and they're producing OH, but they're also producing gaseous nitrogen, N2. So there's a lot of nitrogen that makes its way from living things into the atmosphere. And this is the way that nitrogen is recycled through the atmosphere. So in terms of these major topics that we've looked at, nitrogen cycling, carbon cycling, water cycling, then some of the summaries for this nutrient cycling that we've looked at are listed here. You've got these different metabolic pathways that take place where carbon is transformed from one form to another. You've got sulfur transformed from one form to another. Phosphate, same thing. You've got sulfur, same thing. And nitrogen, especially, a lot of different forms. So those are important, these transformations from one form to another that are carried out by metabolic pathways that you find in different organisms, especially bacteria. Those are important for nutrient cycling through an ecosystem. It's not just going from one organism to another, but it's changing forms from ammonia to nitrite to nitrate to some organic form of nitrogen. There's changes in the composition of these elements, what else they're bound to or bonded with. And then in an ecosystem, you've got different habitats. You've got the air, you've got the water, you've got the soil, you've got land, you've got above the soil. And so the way that these nutrients cycle, especially nitrogen, is dependent on whether there's oxygen there or not, whether you have aerobic metabolic pathways or whether you have anaerobic metabolic pathways, especially for bacteria that can carry out metabolic pathways in the absence of oxygen, unlike most organisms. And there's different sources of energy. Some things can use these different forms. Most things that we're familiar with are like animals and need some source of organic fuel that contains carbon that can be broken down, something like a sugar. But other organisms can use other things to generate ATP, whether it's some inorganic substance or whether it's some form of nitrogen. They can use those as a source of energy. That's what everything needs in order to survive, is energy. We're familiar with this. You eat something to get energy, but there's other ways that organisms, especially bacteria, can derive energy. And in terms of the flow of these nutrients through the different ecosystems, the different things have different mechanisms for obtaining these nutrients, for converting these nutrients. But bacteria have a lot of different aspects of this in terms of these conversions from one form to another. But even in plants and animals, mechanisms for obtaining these, and then there's transformations that take place in the body of plants or animals. And then we also saw in an ecosystem, in a community, there's different roles. There's the producers in the first place, whether they're using light energy at the little tiny fraction that uses chemicals. There's consumers. There's the consumers that eat plants, basically. And then there's consumers that eat animals, secondary consumers that eat other things. And along with energy that's being transferred from one organism to the next, that's one of the main reasons why they're eating something, is to obtain energy. But along with that comes these nutrients as well. Nutrient cycling is a little more complex. There's a number of different nutrients than energy. Everything certainly needs energy, but there's all these different compounds, important biological compounds, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids that are primarily made of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. And some of them contain phosphate, some of them contain phosphorus, some of them contain nitrogen. So in that way, the cycling of these nutrients makes its way from one organism to the next. They have different roles, different forms, and it's all interwoven in terms of this nutrient cycling. So what I want to end with is, again, going back to this idea that there's a big difference between the flow of energy through ecosystems, which is what we looked at first. Energy, the most energy comes from the sun, almost all energy in an ecosystem. And you've got these primary producers. You've got plants or phytoplankton or algae or blue-green algae, something like that. They're eaten by herbivores, primary consumers, and those are eaten by secondary consumers. And you can have 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7 trophic links, things that are eating something else. But along the way, as energy is being transformed from one organism to the next, or transferred from one organism to the next, most of the energy is lost. So these squiggly red arrows represent this loss of energy, and we saw that it could be 80%, 90% of the energy that's lost from one organism to the next. So in this, quantifying the amount of energy, you can look at it in terms of the amount of biomass. There's a huge amount of biomass of plants, that big green rectangle. There's a lot fewer herbivores, but there's still a considerable number. And there's even fewer secondary consumers. And if you went to tertiary consumers, third level, fourth level, fifth level, then these squares, rectangles, would get smaller and smaller and smaller. Energy is lost each transformation, whereas with nutrients, nutrients are cycled. The carbon is cycled around amongst organisms, in the air, in the water, in the sediments, in rocks. Phosphorus, cycled around. Nitrogen is cycled around. Water is cycled around. Sulfur, cycled around. And if you look at oxygen, oxygen is cycled around as well. Oxygen makes its way between, especially oxygen and carbon dioxide, those two main forms. Something that we didn't look at in a lot of parts of the ecosystems, except for a few exceptions, are oxygen's relatively abundant and not so limiting, except when you're talking about water. So if you asked yourself this question, or if somebody asked this question of you, or you're thinking about this in the first place, how do ecosystems function? Well, there's a lot of different things that go into answering that question. But two of the main needs that every living thing has, one is energy. And energy flows through ecosystems in this one way. If you look at this figure, it's in these red arrows. It enters in mostly from the sun and goes from one organism to another organism to another organism, and it's lost as heat. It's gone. If you look at these nutrient cycles, and these blue arrows, then nutrients are cycled around from one organism to the next, and also from water, soil, sediments, but they're maintained within ecosystems. There's no new source of these elements coming from outer space like the sun that's producing all this energy. And so in the end, you've got flow of materials through ecosystems. And you've got energy flowing through one way, you've got nutrients and elements flowing through another way. And that is a good summary of nutrient cycling, or at least not just nutrients but energy, flow of materials through an ecosystem. And now, for the last part of the course, we're going to shift our attention to human interactions. That's what we're going to talk about on Friday, and then a little on Monday as well.